It is February of 1915. What few trenches were constructed on the Western Front lay silent. They will never grow into the complex web of burrows and dugouts that we saw them become over 4 years of war. As now the fighting in the West is over, the German advance stalled. However, they were able to gain a sizable colony in Africa through negotiations. France boasts that it kept the Krauts back. A peace deal is signed. The war to end all wars, at least on the Western Front, never comes to be. The flare-up of 1914 quickly becomes another part of the heated rivalry between two European powers. While peace in the West is here for now, it settled nothing. It only set the stage for conflicts to come. Yet the players have changed, the events shifted, and how or why such a future war may occur entirely different. But it will still come. So let's continue to flesh out this world in much more detail. The immediate response, once the war is over, is one of disappointment, except perhaps for Belgium. Each nation has a population, politicians, and generals who heavily disagree with how quickly the war ended, believing that this was their prime opportunity to settle the score that had been building for decades. Such a quick resolution would feel insincere. The enemy was still out there. This goes down a War of 1812 path, where there was really no clear loser or winner, and the only matter is perspective. Peace is a difficult thing to maintain, especially as the Eastern Front would still be going on. As we know with hindsight, the Russians were never going to win the war, even with British and French help. But to Russia, in this alternate world, they would only see the Western Agreement as the ultimate betrayal, throwing them aside to deal with Germany alone. Which, the British and French would be doing. While the Tsar's days were limited no matter what, whoever inevitably takes over wouldn't forget the treachery of 1914. A deal with Western Europe would always be a foolish thing to do. Within France and Britain, the quick peace is criticized for the same reasoning. They simply can't disconnect themselves from what's going on in the East. As Germany advances and quickly breaks down the Russian war effort, there's more calls for the Western Front to open up again. Germany needs to be stopped before they carve up Russia. The Winston Churchills and those sorts, perhaps commenting that Germany will have her way with the vast open plains of the East. Or something like that. We can say this alternate timeline is much better with hindsight, as we know where such a total war leads to. The disillusionment, vast amount of death, rise of extreme ideologies leading to World War II. But to the people living in this moment, all they would see is their greatest fears finally realized. A German Europe. The fear over a German-dominated Europe was a major theme in the late 19th century leading up to World War I. It was so prevalent it inspired one of the very first invasion novels, the 1871 book The Battle of Dorking, which told about a Britain in the future world of the 1920s that had been invaded and occupied by a nameless German-speaking state. Coincidentally, it was reprinted in 1914. This was a state that went from not existing to defeating the biggest land power on the continent in the span of a lifetime. Berlin replaced Paris and London as the center of education and commerce. Germany was building up its navy in an attempt to beat Britain at its own game. It was a terrifying prospect for these two European empires that had dominated for centuries to now be dealing with a militaristic, intelligent, and prosperous adversary. As we can tell by today, these same fears inspire invasion stories in the very same way. In this alternate timeline, the more Germany gains in the East, the less stable the political situation becomes in the West. Any politician that had agreed to the 1914 peace most likely wouldn't see another term. Fear runs rampant. Despite the war ending by Christmas and the peace being relatively neutral, we would all know which nation truly won out. By 1915, Russia's war effort would inevitably collapse, even harsher than our own timeline. Germany only needed to focus on one front now, so the gains are greater, the death toll for Russia larger, and the resource drain even more prominent. Eventually, the Russian numbers simply don't matter, and they're pushed farther and farther back. There is no stalemate in the East. Germany and Austro-Hungary simply sweep Russia. It's very likely this obliteration of their forces, like I said before, leads to revolutions, just as it did in 1905. And while Lenin would not be shipped to Russia, this still doesn't mean the Soviets don't rise. The Bolsheviks or some far-left revolutionaries were still prevalent and may eventually still try to take charge. No matter who is in charge of Russia, it doesn't matter, as they will lose their territory to Germany no matter what. Any treaty that is given to whatever faction that may be in charge of Moscow carves up the empire. Civil war was inevitable, Lenin or not, but for the time being there is no question who the victor of the Greater War was. Germany will win in the East. It's a quicker, more effective victory without the stalemate and grinding starvation Russia had to face. Instead, it's an immediate slap in the face to the Russian Empire and proof that they can't hold their western lands. At the end of this alternate war, Germany makes harsh demands to Russia, similar to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. There is the creation of multiple European states with ties to Germany, but we'll talk about that in a bit. In this moment, the fighting on two fronts is over, and it would be a gut punch to the West. If there was any inclination that the Western Front ending was neutral for both parties, it'd be thrown out by now. The population would be furious. The politicians voted out. Oh, I see where you're going with this. Britain and France believe they lost World War I, so they turned to fascism like Germany did in our timeline. No. While France and Britain would vote out the politicians who gave Germany peace, and there would be more of a shift to the nationalistic right, fascism rising in both nations is not a major possibility. Fascism arises in nations that have a disillusionment, a humiliation, or extreme economic troubles, millions of young men out of work. Their national prestige is a little damaged, but it's still intact, unlike Germany or Italy was after World War I. France would never be able to live with such a strong Germany and begins building up even more of a military. Britain outproduces Germany with their navy simply to keep this new continental power on the continent. The alliance between Britain and France only strengthens after the defeat of Russia, and although these two would have a fear of a stronger, more prosperous Germany, it doesn't mean that Germany was going to be stronger and more prosperous, because they wanted a victory in the East, and they got one. Now, they have to live with the consequences. The Central Powers assert themselves going into the 1920s as the strongest continental powers in Europe. Since this does accidentally fall into what if Central Powers won World War I territory, I apologize, but these are similar events. First off, what is asserted is that strong monarchies are here to stay, while the other Central Powers are just super interesting. Right now, let's focus on Germany itself, an empire now at its greatest extent, with territory from the Rhine to the Baltics, and even perhaps Ukraine, all under the influence of its Kaiser. Oh god, Germany still has a Kaiser. The victor in the East has left Wilhelm II in control of a large portion of Europe, and as Uncle Ben once said, big power, big responsibility. And that's what Germany now has, responsibility over a lot of non-German speaking people and a large border with a very fractured Russia. Germany never falls to the Nazis, so that's good. Yet I think because people hate Nazis so much, we kinda often forget just how terrible of a leader Wilhelm II truly was. Not evil terrible, stupid terrible. He purposely destroyed alliances and bonds Otto von Bismarck had built up. His actions helped create a system of alliances against Germany that plunged Europe into war. He had none of the qualities of his grandfather for military expansion, nor the sentimental intelligence of his father. Instead, he was boisterous, brash, arrogant, and took advantage of the massive success that Germany had built up to bully everyone else. It ultimately destroyed his throne, but in this new, alternate world, that boisterous energy paid off, and he now has to oversee the aftermath. At the height of Prussian prestige in the early 1920s, I really doubt it could be held for so long. In fact, such a quick war may only make Wilhelm attempt to flex his power even more. One that certainly doesn't help the situation of an already angry France and Britain. But they would have to wait, as Germany now has to babysit their puppet states in the east from falling to rebellion or perhaps another Russian incursion. Even if Lenin was perhaps not put into power, War, or even if the October Revolution didn't happen exactly as it did in our timeline. The groundwork already existed in Russia for an eventual deposing of the Tsar and an inevitable civil war. A civil war that the Allies attempted to aid by sending resources, weapons, and troops to the White Army, but that ultimately failed. A civil war that, in this alternate timeline, Germany most of all would have a great interest in the outcome of. The war in the East for Germany wouldn't really end. The German point of getting involved in the war wouldn't be to bring back the Tsar, it would be to stop them commies. One main reason the White Army fell was because they were never truly unified. They were more like warlords that simply banded together while wanting power themselves. But Germany wouldn't really have a need for this. They would aid the White Army, sure, but mainly they'd simply invade Russia itself, brutally putting down the Red Army and sympathizers in that good old Prussian fashion. So they'll fund, arm, and support the White Army, and not just a way to defeat Bolshevikism, but to bring about a puppet in Russia. Not to bring back the monarchy, but to create a puppet dictatorship. The Russian Civil War in this alternate timeline takes on a much different perspective, not only as a potential rise of a communist state, but the first time Germany would flex its imperial muscle in a post-World War I Europe. How successful this may be, I can't predict. But the red chances of forming the Soviet Union are much less when facing down a modern military power right on their doorstep. Those who perhaps made a deal with the Germans takes power. Propaganda is used to portray the betrayal of 1914 as the reason why the Russian people must never trust Britain and France ever again. The reality for Europe going into the 1920s and 30s will be one dominated by a very emotional and erratic Kaiser. I'd imagine such success only dampens the prosperity Germany could have seen after a quick victory. Any rebellion or action taken against Germany's puppet state project in the East, any disloyalty by the Russian puppets it put in, any incursion into Russia by the Japanese or Chinese would only be viewed as a personal attack, as Wilhelm often took political matters. On top of this, Germany must also prop up the failing Austro-Hungarians. For the time being, Germany is still culturally and economically the center of Europe, despite these problems. That certainly isn't the same for their former allies. Austria-Hungary was an absolute joke of an empire that hadn't even existed up to 100 years before the war, but let's just talk about them more specifically anyway. With the ceasefire in the west, the Germans send more troops down into the Balkans to aid their allies. For the Austro-Hungarians specifically, this war would be considered a victory, as Serbia would be temporarily pacified. However, it wouldn't have solved their major issues. With Franz Ferdinand dead, the crown went to Charles I, who would be overlooking a victorious Austria-Hungary, but only thanks to Germany, which doesn't really look good to the prestige of an empire when you only won because of your northern ally. The situation resembles Italy after World War I, where they technically won, but didn't see many benefits. The life of the aging Habsburg dynasty was at an end, but I could see one way it'd attempt to keep itself together, a confederacy. This was an idea proposed by Charles I at the end of the war in our timeline in some desperate attempt to keep all the minorities from declaring independence. It didn't work, of course, because the Allies just wanted to break up Austria-Hungary, but had this occurred in peacetime, a decade or so down the line, perhaps the minorities would agree to it, Austria-Hungary becoming just as disunified as the Holy Roman Empire, but in the 20th century. Either that or the empire collapses in on itself, Yugoslavia style, resulting in a brutal civil war witnessed by everyone in Europe, perhaps even dragging the nations back into a world war. Had they survived, this was really the only two options. The Ottomans, however, would be in a better position, but not by much. In this alternate timeline, the Ottomans, or Turkey, exist mostly as a puppet of the Germans, who over the next few decades import German workers and civilians into Anatolia, much like how Russia brought ethnic Slavs into the East. These German towns were a very real plan made to overlook one main thing: a railway. One that goes from the coast of the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, away from the British Navy. This railway would be the Germans' next plan for the following century, to export oil out of the Middle East and into an ever-industrializing empire. And the Ottomans, or eventually Turkey, would be more than happy to build such a railroad. as it would allow them to extend their influence into the remote regions of their empire. In our timeline, this railway ended at Baghdad and stopped thanks to the war, but had the Germans maintained a victory and continued on with this project, it would have made sea travel to the Persian Gulf entirely unnecessary. Arab insurgents lead to constant squabbles across the desert to maintain this vital supply line. Instead of the British and French officially making these areas colonies and dividing them up, instead they're unofficially regions of interest for Germany, for which a war could easily begin. Where exactly the next war may begin can really be anywhere, be it over a colony in Africa, some diplomatic breakdown, a skirmish on the North Sea, competition over the Middle East, or even some damn conflict in the Balkans. When or where can't be predicted. So let me clarify, this scenario can really diverge at any point. Nothing is set in stone, so let me lay out a few possibilities. A war in the 20s would really be World War I, Part 2. Or the Franco-Prussian War, Part 3. It'd resemble the World War I we all know and love. A brutal slog where no side wishes to have a peace deal sign again, and one side must utterly lose, just with a bit more modern weapons. The most likely cause of the war I could see is Germany fails to control its eastern holdings, and everyone jumps on. War in the 30s would be probably the same way. An alternate 1940s, however, is where things become truly interesting. The West never truly would have experienced a massive war since the Napoleonic era. The type of damage modern weaponry could do, the tactics or the ethics that were all shaped by the First World War don't exist. Instead, it's a mostly modernized 19th century mentality against the enemy. Germany would lead Europe in science and technology, not hampered down by decades of reparations, political instability, or the rise of the Nazis. And while it doesn't have the same empire and reach compared to Britain or France, it has more than its neighbors in terms of land and connection to the Persian Gulf. Since it was the leading nation in science, it also birthed the top minds, such as Albert Einstein. Had Germany not been controlled by the Nazis with their terrible disorganization and disbelief in atomic science, Germany could have easily been the first nation to get the bomb. The next World War could simply see strategic nukes dropped on enemy positions just as casually as any other weapon, simply a bigger bomb. And if you doubt that the German Empire would invest in such a weapon, keep in mind they did try to produce far more dreadnoughts against the British. Attempting to encompass all military options was within their character. There is no telling what the outcome of such an alternate conflict would be, nor the players, but I'll make a few guesses. Britain, France, and most likely the United States would be united in their front against Germany. Germany would only have isolated themselves more after the war, yet it'd still retain a few allies. Germany would not have the resources to successfully fend off the Allies. This alternate ceasefire would have been a miracle to keep the German Empire alive, if only for a few more decades. And had Germany began to lose the war, and perhaps was already developing a nuclear program out of desperation, they would resort to terrible measures. So, to begin wrapping this up, let's say somehow Germany did win. The Kaiser eventually would die, leaving his son Wilhelm III briefly on the throne. Wilhelm III died of a heart attack, and he probably would still do the same in this timeline. His crown would pass to his son, known as Wilhelm IV, who would now live a much longer life and reign without the rise of the Nazis, the renouncement of his throne, and his death in France during our own World War II. But I doubt this would be the outcome. Germany, for all its power, simply didn't have the colonial reach, resources, and manpower as its enemies did combined. Germany as an empire would not last with the next war. The Allies after the war take note about how Austria-Hungary broke up. The Allies may force Germany into, once again, a confederation like the Holy Roman Empire, splitting up Prussia itself to make sure that it can never reunite the regions. Germany as a state no longer is allowed to exist. Not like the West and East divisions of our own timeline. it just simply doesn't exist. The center of the continent once again becomes a series of competing small European nations. How this may play out, I cannot say. However, I'd imagine a rise in nationalism and potentially fascism as a way to bring Germany back from foreign occupation. In maintaining the peace, there are many roads that can now be traveled. This alternate conflict would be a combination of World War I ideology with World War II destruction, resulting in the same disillusionment from 19th century ideals of empire and patriotism, even for the victors. And the sole beneficiary from this would be the United States. Safe from the destruction as it was in our timeline, some things never would have changed. Owning the span of a continent separated from the rest of the world often has those advantages. One that Germany never would have had, even with its mass imaginary extent. There was a miracle in 1914, one that led to millions of men not dying on the Western Front. And yet, from this Christmas miracle, the world kept turning, and the ramifications of such a great act led to the transformation of Europe in ways nobody could imagine. The war to end all wars never occurring as we saw it, but resurfacing as potentially the real war to truly end all wars. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.